The release of the next Five Nights at Freddy's game is this Thursday, which means that once again I am making a video that will be outdated in mere days. Welcome to Good Idea, Bad Idea, my name is GiBi. Ludonarrative dissonance is a term so pretentious that pointing out how pretentious it is has become a trope done by pretentious people. The term combines ludo, meaning game, narrative, meaning story, and dissonance, meaning non-harmonious. Does not go well together. The term was used so much in the year 2020 for some strange reason that I figured it was impossible to ever use in a serious manner again. But one thing I've learned on YouTube is that trends that are over 3 years old are completely foreign to the vast majority of the population. So we're going to talk about the ludonarrative relationship between Five Nights at Freddy's and virtual reality. So I can explain why staring at the upcoming release date of Help Wanted 2 excites the neurons in my brain more than any FNAF game in the last 5 years. The term ludonarrative dissonance is often associated with the game Bioshock, which is incredibly dumb, because Bioshock is the ideal example of a game whose gameplay and story line up in an almost one-to-one fashion. If anything, it's ludonarrative harmony, but the essay that created the term used Bioshock as its key example. I'm going to spoil Bioshock now, which should be a crime because it is one of the greatest video games ever made, and while it is a great game on its own, its story is a big aspect of that, so if you don't want to hear spoilers, jump to this timestamp. Bioshock is a linear first-person shooter where you run around some cool locations. You speak to various characters over the course of the campaign, and they act as guidance for you. They tell you where to go and who to shoot, and then you just go on your way and blow up some guys. The story tackles the themes of Randian objectivism, which discusses free will and the ethics of selfishness. But for some reason, this smart journalist guy played the game and he thought it was a failure of a game that none of your decisions that you make as you play matter in the end. He called this ludonarrative dissonance because the story is telling you that free will is the most important objective and that you should be selfish. But then the game doesn't actually give you any free will. And yeah, dude, that's the point. Randian objectivism is named after Ayn Rand, the libertarian philosopher most famous for her books Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead. The villains of Bioshock are named Andrew Ryan, which kind of sounds like Ayn Rand, and Fontaine, which sounds like fountain. I'm stupid and I forgot to mention that Fontaine pretends to be a guy named Atlas throughout the entire game. The game takes place in a collapsed society built originally on objectivism. The point of the game is that objectivism is bad. So when the game takes away your free will, that's not ludonarrative dissonance, that's ludonarrative harmony. At the end of the game, you discover that you were basically hypnotized and that you were forced to carry out the objectives of the people who've been speaking to you. You have no free will. And this is genius for a video game, because the character is being controlled, with no say in the matter, by you, the player. Ludo-wise, if he does something out of character, it's because he was being controlled by you. Narrative-wise, if he does something out of character, it's because he was being controlled by the villain. This is some arbitrary dead air to allow the people who skipped the spoiler earlier to return. How's it going? What are you guys going to do with all that time you saved, skipping ahead in the video? I hope you use it to pet a dog. Similar ludonarrative harmony comes from the early Assassin's Creed games. The story is about a guy in the modern world named Desmond who is shoved into what's basically a virtual reality machine. The machine can read his thoughts and play out situations from his ancestors' memories. So you, the player, are not playing as Ezio or Altair, you're playing as Desmond, playing as Ezio and Altair. So when Ezio is killed by random guard number 4, or when he goes on a murder streak, or when he drowns in a puddle, this is not dissonance between the gameplay and the story, because the game is actually explicitly telling you that that didn't actually happen. In the story, that is Desmond taking a common gaming L, and then the simulation is reset. It's actually one of the best examples of gameplay and story being in sync. So much so, that it's literally an aspect of the game to try to act in character to increase your synchronization. You know what's kind of silly? If Mario hates Bowser, then how come he invites him to go go-karting? That is some gameplay ludo dissonance right there. In creating art, I would say that there's nothing that is actually bad. Everything you do creates or causes a certain effect or reaction, and that's only bad if the reaction is not what you intended. I think most people would agree that if you're making a film, you want the audience to watch the film. You don't want them looking away from the screen, you don't want them plugging their ears, you want them to actually watch the movie. So I think most people would say that it's the goal of any film, and of all filmmakers, to make a movie that people would watch. And I specifically mean like 2 hours actually in a movie theater film, not some weird art house film, 7 hours of watching a bird squawk. I think most people think that when you're making a film, you want the people to look at it. Except that's wrong, because one of the most popular genres of film is horror, which intentionally tries to get you to close or cover your eyes and plug your ears. If you're doing that, then they're doing something right. Ludonarrative dissonance is not a bad thing. It's just a thing that can be used to get the audience to react a certain way. The perceived ludonarrative dissonance of Bioshock actually drives its theme home stronger. The ludonarrative dissonance of Five Nights at Freddy's actually helped launch the entire theory community. The gameplay of Five Nights at Freddy's has you acting as Mike Schmidt, desperately trying to survive the night by the skin of your teeth. The goal of the gameplay is to survive, and then to leave. The story is that you're an average guy doing a job being hunted by killer robots. And then you return to the job the next night anyway. Why are you, the player, spending your time and energy helping Mike escape the restaurant if he's just going to return the next day? That's stupid. That's ludonarrative dissonance. It's so stupid, in fact, that MatPat brought it up in his first game theory video about the franchise.
The Freddy's Pizzeria you work in now are just the nightmares that haunt you. You are the killer. The nightmare is also why everything is so surreal. Posters switching at random, heads on the animatronics glitching, why you find yourself back there night after night. Even after you complete your 5 nights, you're unable to leave this terror, the threat of death, the guilt, because it never ends. And in a delightfully ironic twist, your personal hell forces you to supervise the exact same security footage that led to your capture in the first place.
Matt's theory here obviously ended up not being true, but it did raise the question of, why did Mike come back? That's a question that the series would spend the next half-dozen games answering. And they answered them in a way that I do find personally satisfying. I'm not going to call Scott Cawthon the most genius game writer ever who had everything figured out, but there is an argument to be made that he did intentionally use ludonarrative dissonance to get the player to ask an important question. That being, what is the motivation of Mike Schmidt? Whether or not Scott did this on purpose doesn't really matter, because since then, people have discussed whether he did it on purpose or not, meaning that it is likely top of mind for him. Kind of like how Scott would eventually have the plot of the killer being stuck in the afterlife, having to face down the people they killed in the form of robots as the plot to UCN. Like, that was probably not his idea in the beginning, but it's hard to imagine that he didn't watch Matt's video. It's hard to imagine that that didn't inspire him. And so likewise, I think as we go into Help Wanted 2, I think we should keep in mind that Scott has done this kind of thing before. Scott has made purposefully poor decisions in the past to try to steer us in the right direction. I swear that is not just me coping, it makes a lot of sense, just hang on. Help Wanted 1 did not create any ludonarrative dissonance. The gameplay was overcoming challenges based on the FNAF characters, and that's great. And the story is that you, Vanessa, are testing a new game, and that beating the game then allows you to become possessed by Glitch Trap. Beating the game is the bad ending, but you don't know that until you get to the ending. There's this satirical comic that makes fun of the exact kind of games journalist who would bring up ludonarrative dissonance, and the joke is basically that pretentious people read into basic game design way too closely. To jump or not to jump? But, like, actually that might be intentional in Help Wanted? The good ending of the game is the ending where Vanessa doesn't get possessed by Glitch Trap, which is the ending where she doesn't beat the game, she doesn't get all the tapes. But that requires that you, as the player, do not beat the game and collect all the tapes. You can only get this good ending by not beating it, You would think that this is ludonarrative dissonance because the correct option is not to play, but the game is telling you to play. But it's not really, because Tape Girl, the person speaking to you, is lying. She's the bad guy. The dissonance makes sense because you're being lied to. The story in the game is telling you something different than the gameplay, but the gameplay is right and the story is wrong because the narrator's lying. You realize this at the end of the game, but then you lost, and it's too late. It actually ends up being very synchronous that the game is telling you that VR is bad. Security Breach is a game that basically starts over fresh with a new protagonist. Yes, there are familiar characters, but it is not a sequel to Help Wanted. The Tales from the Pizzaplex books that came out in tandem with Security Breach tell multiple stories of characters who get stuck in virtual reality type experiences to their detriment. Ruin, the most recent game before Help Wanted 2, is about a girl who puts on what is basically a VR mask, and it causes negative effects to befall her. Now, in none of these games is this an issue, but in Help Wanted 2 it is, because it's a sequel, because it's the same franchise that just spent 2 games and multiple books telling you about the evil that can befall you when you enter VR. And then it's asking you to enter VR to play it. By the nature of this being a sequel, there is part of the story that happens before it begins. Basically, where the story left off is that you shouldn't enter VR, but then the gameplay is requiring you to enter VR, and that is, by definition, ludonarrative dissonance. Anyone who played Help Wanted and Ruin should get the message that VR is spooky. So then why are they playing Help Wanted 2? And I don't mean why are you, the real person, playing Help Wanted 2. Obviously, you're a real person, you understand that it's just a narrative, it's a story, but within the fiction of the universe that we agree to accept when we interact with it. Right? Like if you're watching a play, you agree to pretend that the audience isn't there, that there's a fourth wall around the actors. When we agree to play Five Nights at Freddy's, when we load up the game, we're agreeing to enter into its world. We have to ignore the fact that we know that things like ghosts and mind control and rabbits aren't real. We're expected to interact with the game on its own terms. And its own terms is that it's a VR game about how VR games are dangerous. So we're in danger, so we should stop playing. Basically what I'm saying is that we've returned to the initial FNAF problem, which is the ideal thing story-wise for Mike Schmidt to do would be to not return to Freddy's. So after Night 1, we should just stop playing the game. After Help Wanted 1, we should stop playing VR games. Except that in FNAF 1's case, there is a reason. There is a motivation. It does make sense for Mike to return to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. And so what I'm basically claiming in this video is that there might be a reason to return to VR in Help Wanted 2. It might be explained in that game, or it might be explained in a game or a book in the future. But since this is something Scott has done before, I can only sit here and hope that he comes to a similarly satisfying conclusion as he did with the original FNAF saga. That all of these things that seem nonsensical or contradictory, or these puzzle pieces that don't fit together, that once he reveals what he has in mind for the story, that somehow they will. That we'll understand the motivations of the characters. That we'll know if the narrator speaking to us is lying or not. It's been half a decade, and nobody really knows what's going on. And I really do hope that we get some answers on Thursday.